This is the podcast overview for the objectives that go along with Chapter 5, the impact of stress on health conditions. So, in this chapter, we're going to be taking a look at some of the biggest health conditions that have been found to be associated with stress. Some of the research is mixed. There is strong evidence for the connection of certain diseases to stress. There's kind of mediocre or mixed evidence for other illnesses and their connection to stress. And then there's some weak evidence connecting stress with certain illnesses. So you want to make sure that you understand which conditions carry with it the strong evidence. And so for that, we really start talking about, well, just to back up the overview of everything, stress related, when an illness or a physical health problem is associated with stress, we usually refer to it as a functional syndrome because they're often, these are health conditions that don't have a detectable organic cause. So one might do different tests on a person and find nothing, no evidence of disease, yet the person has symptoms. And somehow those symptoms can be creating a great deal of despair for the person, or maybe limitation in what they're able to do. And oftentimes stress is considered to be or suspected to be a cause or an underlining contributing agent to that stress illness. So we think of things like irritable bowel syndrome being a good example of a functional syndrome. So when we look at the strong evidence for cardiovascular disease, we see an overwhelming amount connecting cardiovascular disease to stress. Not necessarily that stress causes cardiovascular disease, but it's very closely connected and associated. So the first part of the chapter is going to walk you through what cardiovascular disease is, coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, being able to understand the various types then of heart disease and its component, which it breaks down for you, what happens to the arteries during heart disease, plaque, atherosclerosis, arteriosclerosis, and so understanding sort of the differences between those, what happens when a person has a heart attack, otherwise known as a myocardial infarction, angina, acute coronary syndrome, sudden cardiac death. These are obviously the extremes, but it's going to walk you through all that. And then some of the sort of precursors, which might be hypertension, high cholesterol, hypertension, otherwise known as high blood pressure, and those can have direct links to stress. And then I think the last part that it's going to walk you through is just the connections to emotions. So there's a lot of emotion connected to heart disease, in particular the emotions of anger and hostility, sort of the type A behavior pattern. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at what that is in particular. And then it ends with some preventions or strategies for prevention of heart disease, as well as how we treat heart disease. What would be the different coping strategies there? Okay, so that's like a big portion of the beginning of the chapter, and then it gets into the links of stress between skeletal muscle conditions, also strong evidence there. Lots of research done there with the heart muscles, smooth muscles, a lot of this recorded via EMG, which is electromyograph, different types of headaches, tension type headaches and migraine headaches, and their connection to stress. Some very close connections there, as well as jaw issues, bruxism and temporomandibular disorder, TMJ is sometimes referred to as, or TMPDS, which is a dysfunction syndrome. Again, that word syndrome keeps popping up because it tends to be a set of symptoms that aren't exactly the same for everyone. There's some commonalities, but in each person they're sort of unique. So it's going to walk you through some of that, and then some behavioral treatment strategies for that, as well as some preventative strategies. And then lastly, in the camp of strong evidence, we have atopic disorders like asthma, allergic rhinitis, and atopic dermatitis. Those would be the big ones there that are connected to stress. Basically, atopic disorders just being health disorders that are characterized by some sort of a hypersensitivity, biologically hypersensitive. And it can be characterized by things like inflammation, like with asthma in the lungs, and in the nose for allergies. And a lot of that is related or has been found to be related to stress or exacerbated by stress. So the book covers all of those conditions as well as coping strategies. Then it moves into an area of mixed evidence for the connection of stress to various illnesses or disorders. And so you want to be able to explain what they mean by that mixed evidence. With cancer, the evidence isn't clear. There's some studies that show a connection between stress and cancer, specifically those who have suffered extreme stress, like trauma-related stress, and just looking at their lifespan and things that they've been through. But the problem is that a lot of this research is self-reported, which again, we can't rely heavily on that self-report. So then it goes into talking about some different prevention and coping strategies that would help with that a little bit. And then we spend the rest of the chapter looking at those conditions that have a weak association with stress and why. And those would be some of the more popular kind of culprits that we tend to think of in society as being directly related to stress. This is what we hear a lot about, but in actuality, the evidence is actually weak. Gastrointestinal system conditions like peptic ulcers have gotten a bad rap as being highly connected to stress. And this was actually talked about in the Stress Portrait of a Killer documentary. They spent a good portion of the time in that documentary looking at ulcers and how it was early on thought that ulcers were caused by stress, diet, other lifestyle issues. But in the past 20 years, they've really started to narrow down on the bacteria, H. pylori, that's connected to these types of ulcers. And these bacteria, which usually are benign and everybody has actually these bacteria in their body, can sometimes inflame the insides of the stomach, the lining of the stomach, the duodenum, and that can lead to an ulcer. And when we look at the relationship between stress and peptic ulcers, there's not a lot of definitive, causal relationships happening there. There's no direct links. And so it talks a little bit about that. And then it goes into looking at some other gastrointestinal issues like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and so forth. Also, systemic autoimmune disorders is another kind of category, which would also include lupus or systemic lupus. And so, there can be some connections to stress there. The research, again, is not super solid, and it's still a little unclear. So to make the claim isn't really a good path to take. Um, there's some connection to rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disorder, characterized by a lot of inflammation around the joints and the tissues around the joints. Um, and so it talks about, why that is. A lot of times stress can trigger that which is already there, so it exacerbates an underlying condition. It doesn't cause it. So it talks about that as well, and then coping strategies with that. So you'll notice every time a disease is mentioned, the book follows up with the appropriate coping strategies and or treatments that might be given for that. So that covers the chapter. So just make sure you're understanding the strong evidence, the mixed evidence, and the weak evidence, which disorders fall under which of those categories. It might be a good idea to map it out, chart it out, whatever is going to make it easier for you to see it visually, compare and contrast them with one another. And I would go back and also rewatch the video. I really have put the same video up this is the third week now, because it covers so much of what we've been dealing with. So it wouldn't hurt to kind of take another peek at that. Okay, thank you.